Before the ocean had a name, before the maps were complete, before men believed the earth could be fully known, there was a boy who looked out upon the sea and wondered what waited beyond the horizon. His name was James Cook. He was born not in a grand city or a noble house, but in a small stone cottage in the quiet Yorkshire countryside of England, on a cold October night in the year 1728. The sea was far away then, a blue dream seen only in stories told by passing travellers or in the silver gleam of the morning sky. But even as a child, James would climb the hill behind his father's farm and stare toward the distant line where the world seemed to end. He said nothing, but in his heart he was already listening to the sound of something calling him from beyond the fields. Life in 18th century Yorkshire was quiet and harsh. The Cook family were labourers, honest, humble, and bound to the soil. Days began before dawn and ended with the last light of the hearth. James helped his father with tools and timber, his hands growing rough before he could write his own name. He was tall for his age, quiet, with eyes that always seemed to be searching for something far away. In the evenings, when the wind was right, he could smell salt on the air from the distant coast. It was faint, just a whisper, but enough to stir his imagination. While others spoke of trade, crops, or church sermons, James dreamed of ships, of stars, and of lands that no one had ever seen. He did not yet know that one day he would sail farther than any man before him. He only knew that the horizon was not a wall, it was a door. When he was 16, James left the fields behind. He walked nearly 20 miles to the small port town of Staithes, where the land met the restless sea. The harbour there was small, just a few fishing boats swaying in the tide, but to him it was the edge of infinity. He found work in a shop by the water, apprentice to a grocer. He swept floors, carried barrels, weighed sugar and salt. But more than anything, he watched. He watched the fishermen bring in their catch at dawn, their boats rocking gently against the wooden piers. He watched the horizon fade each night into mist and starlight, and every time he heard the creak of ropes or the crash of waves against the hull, something inside him stirred. There was peace in it, a rhythm that spoke not of confinement, but of freedom. One evening during a storm, a ship sought shelter in the harbour. Its sails were torn, its crew weary and soaked with rain. James stood on the pier and watched them secure the vessel, their movements sure and practised, their faces calm against the fury of the sea. They worked as one. No shouting, no fear, only purpose. To him they seemed like men of another world, men who had seen the face of the unknown and made peace with it. As lightning lit the waves, he felt something within him awaken. It was not ambition, nor curiosity alone. It was belonging, the quiet certainty that the sea was where he was meant to be. By morning the storm had passed. The ship was gone, but its image stayed with him forever, a shadow moving calmly across an endless sea. At 18, he left Staithes and walked to Whitby, another coastal town not far away. There the docks were busier, brimming with ships bound for London, Norway, and the Baltic. The smell of tar, rope, and salt filled the air. He apprenticed to a shipping firm owned by the Quaker brothers John and Henry Walker, merchants of reputation and discipline. They taught him the art of seamanship, how to read the wind, how to tie knots that could hold against a storm, how to find direction when the stars were hidden and the compass swung uncertain. For the first time he felt the roll of a ship beneath his feet. He learned the way of the sailors, their language, their songs, their silences. Days were long, hands were raw, and the sea was not kind, but he did not mind. He had found his world. The sea became his teacher. It taught him patience, for no man could rush the wind. It taught him humility, for no captain commanded the ocean. And it taught him awe, for in every sunrise he saw creation renewed. By day he worked without complaint. By night he studied the stars. He traced their paths across the sky, learning how they guided ships to safety. He copied maps, memorized coastlines, and began sketching his own. Other sailors laughed. What good are books to a man with rope-burned hands? But Cook smiled quietly. He knew that the stars and the sea spoke the same language, and he was learning to listen. It was a time when the world itself was awakening. The 1700s were an age of discovery, of maps being redrawn, of boundaries dissolving, of curiosity taking the place of fear. Empires sent ships farther and farther into the unknown, seeking new lands, new trade, and new knowledge. But for Cook, it was not wealth or fame that called to him. It was the mystery of it all. He believed the world was vast, and that every wave that broke upon the shore carried a secret from beyond. He did not yet know that one day he would chart lands unmarked by any map, that his name would be written across the oceans themselves. For now he was just a young sailor with steady hands, eyes fixed on the horizon, and a dream that grew each time the tide rose. By his mid-twenties he had risen to the rank of mate on merchant ships sailing across the North Sea. He knew every line, every sail, every sound the sea could make, and yet the horizon kept calling. Merchant routes were familiar, predictable, safe. He longed for the unknown, for a world where no line had yet been drawn. When the Royal Navy began recruiting skilled sailors for exploration, he volunteered without hesitation. It was 1755. England was preparing for war with France, but for James, it was the beginning of something greater. He would soon learn to read not only the sea, but the very shape of the world. One night aboard his first naval vessel, as the others slept below deck, Cook stood alone on the watch. The sea was calm, black as glass, the stars sharp as ice. He traced the constellations with his finger, Orion, Cassiopeia, the Great Bear, his eyes moving from star to star as though reading an old familiar story. He realized then that the sky above and the sea below were mirrors of one another, infinite, unpredictable, but full of meaning for those patient enough to learn. In that stillness he felt both small and infinite, a single man on an endless ocean, yet somehow part of everything that moved within it. The world was vast, yes, but it was also alive, and he, a boy from Yorkshire, was learning to understand its heartbeat. Years would pass, wars would come and go. Cook would rise through the ranks, quiet, capable, unassuming. He would map rivers in Canada, survive storms, and earn respect from men far above his birth. But all of that still waited beyond the horizon, for now he stood on the deck of a small naval ship, the morning wind brushing his face, the gulls crying softly over the waves. Ahead of him lay not conquest, but discovery, not glory, but understanding. And as the first light of dawn touched the sea, he whispered, to no one but the wind, I am ready. The year was 1768, and the world was changing. The maps of Europe were filled, the borders known, the kingdoms drawn in ink and certainty. But beyond those lines, across the vast Pacific, the ocean still whispered secrets. There were lands uncharted, islands unseen, winds unnamed. And in the age of reason and empire, England wanted to know what lay beyond. It was the dawn of the great voyage, the one that would carry Captain James Cook farther than any Englishman had ever sailed, to the far side of the world, to the edge of the known. In the naval docks of Deptford, the small ship waited, modest, sturdy and quiet among the grand frigates and men of war. Her name was HMS Endeavour. She was not built for battle, but for endurance. A collier, refitted for exploration, broad of hull, steady of keel, a vessel meant to carry men and dreams across the longest of distances. Cook inspected her carefully. Every plank, every sail, every rope was measured with the same precision he gave to maps. He ran his hand along the railing, the wood smooth beneath his palm, and imagined the journey ahead. Oceans unbroken by chart, constellations unrecorded, and lands whose very names would be spoken for the first time. The air round the dock smelled of tar and salt. Seamen loaded barrels of dried meat and biscuit, scientists secured chests of instruments, and artists packed their brushes and inks, ready to paint the wonders they hoped to find. The Endeavour would not only be a ship of sailors, it would be a floating world of discovery. The orders were simple in writing, but immense in purpose. Officially, Cook's mission was to sail to Tahiti and observe the rare transit of Venus, a celestial event that, when measured from multiple points on Earth, could help determine the size of the solar system itself. But beneath the scientific language lay another, quieter instruction: to explore the unknown southern oceans and search for the great southern continent. Terra Australis Incognita. It was a mission that blended science and mystery, a perfect reflection of the age. And Cook, with his calm precision and unshakable patience, was the perfect man for it. The Endeavour carried 94 men, sailors, marines, scientists and artists. Among them was Joseph Banks, a young botanist of great curiosity and wealth, who had filled the ship with instruments, seeds, jars and books, his heart as eager for the unknown as Cook's own. There was Charles Green, the astronomer, and Sidney Parkinson, the artist who would sketch every leaf and coastline. The sailors were rough and seasoned, men of the lower decks bound by duty and habit. They respected Cook from the start, not for his rank but for his calm voice, his fairness, and the way he shared their hardships. He ate the same food, stood the same watches, and spoke little, but with meaning when he did. Even before they left England, they knew he was different from other captains. He led not by fear, but by quiet example. On the morning of August 26th, 1768, the tide rolled in strong and full. The Endeavour lifted gently against her moorings as the crew took their stations. The air was cool, the light pale and golden. Cook stood at the helm, eyes fixed toward the river mouth where the Thames met the sea. Behind him lay London, smoke rising, bells tolling, the hum of a world too crowded for his spirit. Ahead lay the unknown, wide, blue and waiting. With a low creak and the groan of the ropes, the Endeavour began to move. The wind caught. The ship glided forward, slow, graceful, inevitable. The men cheered softly, but Cook only watched, silent. He had dreamed of this moment since the hills of Yorkshire, and now it was real. The beginning of everything. Days passed into weeks, and the world became water. Endless horizons, waves that breathed like great sleeping creatures, and skies so vast that even thought seemed small. The routine of the ship took hold. Men on watch, ropes coiled, decks scrubbed, sails trimmed. The air was salt and sunlight by day, stars and silence by night. The Endeavour sailed south past the coast of Africa, the trade winds filling her canvas like lungs. The ocean shimmered blue upon blue, so calm that the men sometimes spoke in whispers, as if afraid to wake it. Cook wrote in his journal each evening. His handwriting was small, deliberate, his words spare but full of quiet wonder. "The sea," he wrote, "is a book without end. Each day I turn a page. Far from land the sky changed. The constellations of the north dipped below the horizon, and new stars rose, bright, unfamiliar, like the scattered jewels of another universe. The Southern Cross appeared one night, 4 points of fire above the mast. Cook stood on deck long after the others had gone below, the sea calm as glass beneath the starlight. He traced the shape of the constellation with his gaze and felt a deep stillness settle in his chest. The sky had always been his guide, but now it felt like a companion, an ancient silent witness to his journey. He whispered into the wind, "As above, so below." The crew grew used to the rhythm of the voyage. They rose with the sun, worked through the day, and sang in the evenings, old sea songs that echoed across the waves. Cook allowed them music, laughter, even games, so long as the decks were kept clean and discipline steady. He understood that a ship was not ruled by fear, but by order and care. He ate with the men when he could, sharing their simple meals of salt beef and biscuit. He walked the decks each night, checking ropes, inspecting rigging, and speaking softly to the lookouts. His presence was calm, like the ocean on a windless day. After months at sea, the first specks of green appeared on the horizon. Small islands, coral, palm and silence, the first signs of a world untouched by Europe's hands. When they anchored off the island of Tahiti, the air was thick with flowers and birdsong. Mountains rose from the mist like sleeping gods. The water was clear as glass, and the people who came to meet them were smiling, curious, unafraid. For the crew, it was paradise. For Cook, it was something deeper. Proof that the world was wider, gentler, and more wondrous than any map had shown. They stayed for months, building an observatory to record the transit of Venus, sharing gifts and learning the rhythms of the island. Banks collected hundreds of plants. Parkinson painted the land in luminous detail. At night, Cook sat on the beach, the surf breaking softly at his feet, and wrote by the light of a lantern. "The stars," he wrote, "shine here as they do at home, but the air is kinder and the sea more forgiving. The world is both one and infinite." The islanders taught them words, songs, and dances. In return, the sailors taught them small pieces of English life, how to write a letter, how to steer a small boat, how to laugh at a bad joke across languages. There were no battles here, no conquest, only curiosity and exchange. Cook treated the islanders with respect rare for his time. He wrote of their intelligence, their grace, their sense of community. He knew this peace could not last forever, that empires and hunger would one day reach these shores, but for now it was enough to simply live beside them under the same sun and stars. After the observations were complete, the Endeavour weighed anchor again. The crew lined the decks as the island faded behind them, its palms bending gently in the wind like farewell hands. They did not know where they would go next, only that they would follow the map where it ended, and beyond that, follow the stars. Cook stood at the bow, his eyes on the horizon. He felt the familiar pull, that quiet voice from the deep, the one that had called him since he was a boy in Yorkshire. He smiled and whispered, "The world is still young." And as the Endeavour turned west into the open Pacific, the sails filled once more with wind, and the ship moved onward, steady, silent, eternal, toward lands no man had yet named. The Endeavour sailed deeper into the Pacific, a sea so wide and still that it seemed to breathe with its own quiet rhythm. Days blended into nights, and nights into days, until time itself felt as endless as the water. The sky turned brighter, the air warmer, and the men began to see islands rise from the horizon, green jewels floating in the blue. Each one appeared like a dream, as if the ocean had grown tired of its own vastness and decided to give birth to land. Cook named these new places carefully, but in his journals he often wrote more poetically, calling them the lands of light. Tahiti lay behind them, but its memory lingered, the scent of fruit, the laughter of children, the songs at night under the palms. The Endeavour carried with it the peace of that island, as if the spirit of the Pacific itself had entered the hearts of the crew. They had come as strangers, but left as guests of the ocean, changed, softened, more aware of the gentle balance of life beyond Europe's storms. Even now, as they sailed away, the men sometimes hummed the islanders' songs. Their rough sailor voices turned tender, echoing across the water under a vast and forgiving sky. Weeks passed. The wind was kind, the sea calm. They saw islands from afar, low coral atolls glowing white in the sunlight, ringed with turquoise lagoons. Sometimes they landed briefly to gather fruit and fresh water. At other times they only drifted near, watching from the decks as people stood on distant shores, waving or calling out in voices carried softly by the breeze. There was no conquest, no clash, only distant greetings, shared smiles across miles of sea. Cook recorded each island, noting its latitude, its reefs, its form. But his words were calm, almost reverent. He knew he was not the first to see these lands, only the first from his world, and so he treated them with care, as one might handle a fragile piece of light. On a clear morning in October 1769, a dark coastline rose slowly from the mist, long green and silent. It was New Zealand, a land known to the Polynesians for centuries, but new to Cook and his crew. The ship anchored in a quiet bay. The air was fresh with the scent of fern and rain. Mountains rose beyond the trees, their peaks wrapped in soft clouds. It was a world of calm wilderness, untamed, unhurried, untouched. Cook went ashore with a small group, stepping carefully onto the damp earth. He looked around and said simply, "This land has a noble beauty." The first meetings with the Maori were cautious, curiosity mixed with fear. Misunderstandings brought moments of tension, but even in those Cook sought peace. He ordered his men to hold their fire whenever possible, to offer gifts, to speak calmly. Over time, trust grew slowly. They exchanged food, and the Maori showed them the rhythm of the land, how to fish, where to walk, which winds to read. At night, the Endeavour lay anchored in still water, the stars shining above the dark hills. From the deck, Cook watched the lights of fires along the shore, each one flickering like a heartbeat in the night. He thought of home, the cold English sky, the narrow rivers, and how small they seemed now compared to this wide, breathing world. For months, Cook and his crew sailed along the coast of New Zealand, measuring, sketching, naming, but never rushing. The coastline twisted and turned, a labyrinth of bays and mountains. They followed it all, until the entire shape of New Zealand emerged like a painting slowly revealed. By the time they left, Cook had drawn one of the most accurate maps of the Southern Seas ever made. But his journals tell a softer story, not of land and line, but of light. The mountains, he wrote, seem to breathe in mist. The forests are dark but not unwelcoming. There is peace in this far corner of the earth, a silence that feels alive. After many months they turned west once more, toward the rising sun, toward new mysteries. The sea changed colour, deep blue giving way to pale green, warm winds carrying the scent of distant continents. They passed coral reefs that glowed beneath the water like stars trapped in glass. Flying fish scattered before the bow, their silver bodies flashing in the light. Each evening, as the sun sank into the sea, Cook stood at the rail in silence. The waves rolled endlessly, each one a breath of the world. He no longer thought of reaching a destination. The journey itself had become the purpose. In April 1770, the lookout's cry broke the morning calm. Land, woe! It came from the east. A long line of coast stretching beyond sight, its cliffs gold under the rising sun. It was the east coast of Australia, a land no European had ever mapped, and yet one that had lived for tens of thousands of years, full of stories the sea itself could not contain. The Endeavour sailed close to shore. Beaches glowed white under the light, and forests shimmered in soft green waves. Birds with strange cries filled the air. Cook named the bay where they landed Botany Bay, for the endless new plants collected there by Banks and Parkinson. But in his journal, he called it something else, the land of light. He wrote, "The air is clear, the sea gentle, and the people watch us from the trees with calm eyes. The world, it seems, is wider and more beautiful than our imaginations allow." For weeks they sailed north along the coast, recording every bay, every reef, every inlet. Sometimes they anchored and came ashore. Sometimes they drifted just beyond the breakers, watching smoke rise from inland fires. The people they met were cautious but proud, their presence quiet and assured, their lives moving with the rhythm of the land. Cook observed carefully. He did not rush, did not command, only watched, listened, learned. He knew that discovery was not about claiming. It was about understanding. And so his maps grew, line by careful line, not as symbols of empire, but as offerings of knowledge. One evening, after a long day of sailing, Cook sat alone at the stern as the ship drifted slowly through calm seas. The stars above were bright and strange, southern constellations that still felt new, as if the sky itself were different here. He wrote quietly by lantern light. These lands, though unknown to us, are full of peace and grace. The people live close to the earth, the air is sweet and the sea gentle. I find no fear in these waters, only wonder. He closed the book and looked out across the waves. The moon was low, the water silvered and still. The Endeavour moved on through the darkness, its sails glowing faintly, a lone vessel beneath an infinite sky. And as he watched, Cook felt something he could not quite name. A quiet joy, a sense that the world was not made to be conquered, but to be known, to be loved, to be remembered. After months of sunlight and calm discovery, the ocean changed. It began with a shift in the air, a faint restlessness that the sailors could feel in their bones. The horizon darkened, and the wind began to speak in a different tongue. The Endeavour sailed north along the great unknown coast, her sails heavy with moisture, her crew quiet. The Pacific, once so kind, had grown temperamental, as if reminding them that beauty and danger were born of the same sea. The first storm came without warning. A low rumble rolled across the water like a distant drum. Then lightning split the sky, white against black, and the world vanished in rain. Waves rose like mountains, crashing against the hull with thunderous force. The Endeavour pitched and groaned, every plank shuddering, every rope straining like a living thing. Cook stood at the helm, soaked to the bone, his hands steady on the wheel. He shouted orders that disappeared into the roar of wind, and the men moved through the storm like shadows. Hours passed, then days. The storm circled them, dragging the ship through walls of rain and screaming wind. Yet even in the chaos, Cook's voice stayed calm. He guided the Endeavour not with panic, but patience, waiting for the wind to turn, listening to the rhythm beneath the noise. When dawn finally broke, the sky cleared, and the crew saw that the Endeavour had survived. Her masts were scarred, her sails torn, but she still floated, stubborn and unbroken. Cook wrote that night, "The sea does not wish to destroy us. It wishes to know if we are worthy to cross it." Weeks later, another trial awaited. The ship sailed through the labyrinth of the Great Barrier Reef, a world of turquoise water and invisible danger. From the deck, it looked like paradise. Shallow lagoons, coral glowing beneath the waves, sunlight dancing on crystal water. But beneath that beauty lay teeth of stone. On the night of June 10th, 1770, the Endeavour struck the reef. The sound was sudden, brutal, a deep cracking roar that froze every heart on board. The ship lurched, timbers split, water rushed in below. The men ran to the pumps, their hands blistered and bleeding as they worked through the night. Cook stood among them, shoulder to shoulder, sweat and seawater mixing on his face. He gave no speeches, no desperate cries, only orders, calm and clear. The men responded to his steadiness more than to any command. For 23 hours they pumped. They threw cannons, barrels, even food overboard to lighten the ship. Every man, from captain to cabin boy, worked until his body failed. At last, as the tide turned, the Endeavour lifted slightly from the reef. The crew hauled the sails, and with the slow grace of something half alive, the ship drifted free. They anchored in a nearby river for repairs, a quiet inlet that Cook named Endeavour River. There, the jungle breathed around them, green and alive, as if the earth itself had decided to cradle them after their suffering. For weeks they stayed by the river, hauling timber, patching hulls and drying torn sails. The air was thick with the scent of rain and eucalyptus. Birds called from the trees, their voices strange and beautiful. The crew worked in silence, their laughter slow to return. They had looked into the heart of the ocean and seen how fragile life could be. At night, they lit small fires on the beach. The flames flickered against the blackness, and the men told quiet stories of home, of wives, of children, of villages far away where the wind smelled of grass, not salt. Cook listened without interrupting. Then he would walk alone to the water's edge, the surf washing around his boots, and stare at the stars. He wondered how many more storms lay ahead, how many more unseen reefs, but in that thought was no fear, only humility. The world, he wrote, is not ours to master. We sail upon its mercy and its grace. When the moon rose, its light shimmered across the river like liquid silver. Fish broke the surface now and then, and the forest whispered with unseen life. Some nights were so still that the men could hear their own hearts beating. Cook spent those nights charting by lantern, his pen scratching softly on paper. He mapped every curve of the river, every headland, every sandbank. He was patient, methodical, as if precision could bring peace. Perhaps it did. Each line he drew was another way of making sense of the vastness around him. The stars above guided his hand. They had never failed him, and as he traced them, he felt again that the heavens and the sea were one, two mirrors reflecting the same eternal calm. When the ship was ready to sail again, many men were weak. Salt meat and biscuit had worn them down. Their bodies longed for fresh food and still ground. Scurvy whispered through the decks, the quiet disease of long voyages. Cook, ever practical, fought it not with medicine but with care. He forced the crew to eat greens, made soup from wild plants, and shared every portion equally. Health, he told them, is a captain's first compass. Under his discipline they recovered. The Endeavour was mended, the men alive, and the ocean waited once more. They set sail, their patched sails glowing gold as morning sun, the river narrowing behind them like a fading dream. The Pacific stretched ahead, silent and infinite. Days passed with no land, no birds, no clouds, only water and sky, the same shade of endless blue. It was here, in that stillness, that the mind began to wander. The men spoke less. The ocean was so vast it swallowed words. Cook too grew quieter. He had mapped continents, survived storms, escaped reefs, and yet the mystery of the sea felt greater than ever. At night, he stood alone on deck, watching phosphorescent waves glow beneath the bow. The light looked like stars trapped in water, a reflection of the sky itself. He thought of the islanders they had met, the peace of their villages, the way they understood the tides not through instruments, but through memory and song. Perhaps they knew more of the sea than all of Europe's scholars combined. Even the strongest hearts falter in the silence. There were moments when Cook questioned the purpose of his voyage. He had risked lives, sailed to the far edge of the world, and for what? A map? A line on paper that might one day fade? But then dawn would come. The sun would rise from the ocean's edge, gold spilling across the waves, and the doubts would dissolve like mist. He would look around at his men, at the ship that had endured, and remember that discovery was not about glory. It was about seeing the world clearly, and in that clarity understanding ourselves. When they finally reached the safety of open sea again, the Endeavour sailed smoother than ever. The storms had tested her, but she had proven faithful. The men were thinner, quieter, older in spirit, but there was peace in their silence. They had seen the sea's fury, and it had changed them. Cook wrote simply, "We are not the same men who left England. We have seen both the kindness and the wrath of the deep, and we are still afloat." As the sun set one evening, the ocean turned to gold. The Endeavour moved through it slowly, leaving behind a wake that shimmered like a path of fire. Cook stood at the helm, the wind cool on his face. He felt no triumph, no pride, only gratitude. He thought of the reef, the river, the men sleeping below deck. He thought of how close they had come to ending, and how beautiful the world still was. The ocean had tested them, but it had also accepted them. And as the Endeavour sailed west once more, Cook whispered to the sea, "You have taken much, but you have given me wonder." The waves answered with a soft hush, like a breath drawn and released, and the night closed around the ship, calm, eternal, forgiving. The world grew quiet again. Months had passed since the Endeavour returned home. England had celebrated her captain, but James Cook was restless. He had seen the Pacific, charted the coasts of lands unknown, stood on shores where no map had yet drawn a line. And yet, in the back of his mind there remained a whisper. It came from the south, from the place where the sea turned to mist, where no man had gone, where the very edge of the earth lay sleeping beneath the ice. In 1772, Cook received new orders. The Admiralty wanted him to sail again, to find, if it existed, the great hidden continent of the southern world, Terra Australis Incognita. It was a place of myth and mystery, said to be vast enough to balance the weight of all northern lands. For centuries mapmakers had drawn it in sweeping arcs of imagination, a shadow continent beneath the known world. Now Cook would sail to see if it was real. He accepted without hesitation. He was no longer chasing fame or discovery. He was following the pull of something deeper, the same silent voice that had called him from the hills of Yorkshire to the sea so long ago. Two ships were prepared, HMS Resolution and HMS Adventure. The Resolution was Cook's new command, sturdy, compact, and built for endurance in the cold. Her timbers were strengthened, her stores packed with salted meat, biscuit, and casks of fresh water. There were also barrels of sauerkraut, a gift from science, a remedy for scurvy that Cook insisted his men eat, even when they complained. He was joined by naturalists and artists, and a crew hardened by years at sea. They were not seeking war or wealth. They were seeking the limits of the world itself. On a grey July morning in 1772, the Resolution and Adventure slipped from port. England faded behind them like a dream, and before them stretched the long empty road of the ocean. Weeks became months. The winds turned colder, the skies greyer, and the stars shifted again, the southern constellations rising, the northern ones fading away. The sea grew wilder, rolling in slow, massive swells that lifted the ships like toys. Spray froze upon the decks. The ropes stiffened with ice. The men wrapped themselves in coats until they looked like ghosts. The Resolution pressed on, southward and southward still, through fog and snow and silence. The ocean itself seemed to change, its colour deepening to a steel grey, its surface dotted with shards of floating ice. The air was sharp, each breath stinging the throat like glass. Yet in that frozen emptiness there was beauty, vast, holy, unearthly beauty. One morning the men awoke to a sight that stilled every voice. Ahead lay a field of ice, endless, white, glittering beneath the low sun. It was not land, but it might as well have been. A solid wall stretching from horizon to horizon. The ocean ended there, or so it seemed. Cook stood at the bow, his breath turning to mist. The ship moved slowly through floating ice, the hull groaning softly as it pushed aside small floes. Seals watched from the edges, their dark eyes shining above the cold water. Birds circled overhead, albatross, petrel, gull, their wings catching the pale light. The world was silent except for the creak of wood and the sigh of wind. In that stillness, Cook felt the immensity of existence, the truth that man was small and the earth was beyond all measure. He did not speak. He simply wrote in his journal, "The world has edges not of land, but of wonder." Days no longer felt like days. The sun barely rose. It lingered just above the horizon, casting long blue shadows across the deck. The men worked quietly, scraping frost from ropes, keeping the pumps moving, tending to fires that smoked and sputtered in the cold. Cook moved among them, his calm presence like a steady flame in the frozen air. He checked the instruments, recorded the temperature, noted the wind. He never complained, never showed weariness. It was as if he drew strength from the silence itself. At night the aurora danced above them, curtains of green and gold rippling across the sky. Even the roughest sailors fell quiet, their faces bathed in shifting light. It was the kind of beauty that humbles, the kind that needs no witness to be real. At last the ice grew too thick to pass. The ships could go no farther south. They had reached the very edge of the world. Cook stood at the helm one morning, the sky pale, the air biting. He looked at the frozen horizon, the end of the earth's navigable path, and he smiled. He had not found Terra Australis, but he had found truth, that the myth of the southern continent was just that, a dream of men who feared the emptiness below. The world was whole, and it was enough. He ordered the ships to turn north. The helmsman obeyed, and the Resolution slowly turned, her bow cutting through the floating ice. Behind them, the white wilderness stretched unbroken, silent, eternal. As they sailed north again, the cold eased, the sea softened, colour returned to the world. The men began to smile again, to sing as they worked, to speak of home. Cook, however, remained thoughtful. He knew they had crossed into a realm few would ever see. He had touched the edge of creation itself, and returned to tell the tale. In his journal, he wrote one final note for the voyage. "I have not found the land that men imagined, yet I have found something greater, proof that the earth is as wide and wild as the mind allows. We are explorers not of land, but of light." Months later, the Resolution anchored in a calm tropical bay. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of flowers. The crew bathed in the sea, their laughter echoing through the palm trees. Cook watched from the shore, his boots sinking into the sand. He looked out at the horizon, where the ocean stretched endless and blue once more. He had been to the edge of the world and come back. The ice, the storms, the silence, they were all part of the same great song. And he knew deep within that the sea had more verses yet to sing. When the Resolution and her sister ship finally turned homeward, the world seemed to sigh with them. The winds grew warmer, the seas gentler, and the air carried once again the scent of life. Not ice, not salt, but flowers and faraway earth. Months of endless blue gave way to green again. Islands appeared like stepping stones in the great ocean, each one a breath of comfort after so much silence. The men stood at the rails for hours, watching palm trees rise from the horizon as if from a dream. Some smiled, some wept. For all of them, home was no longer just a place. It was a promise carried in the heart. And yet, as they sailed closer to civilization, James Cook felt something stirring within him. A quiet unease, as though the sea were whispering that his journey was not yet over. It would take nearly 3 years before the Resolution returned to England. They crossed oceans, traced coastlines, and stopped in distant harbours to trade and rest. Everywhere they went, Cook made notes on the stars, the tides, the languages of the people they met. He recorded the shape of the moon, the colour of coral, the pattern of shells. He saw meaning in everything. The smallest flower on a cliff face, the curl of wind on the water, even silence became part of his study. The way it changed from sea to sea, the way it carried memory. When storms came, he met them as old friends. When calm returned, he wrote until his ink ran dry. The men followed his steadiness as they always had. To them he was no longer just their captain. He was the compass itself. When the Resolution finally sailed up the Thames in the summer of 1775, England greeted her with cheers and bells. Crowds gathered on the river banks. Newspapers printed his name in bold letters. Captain Cook returns from the end of the earth. But the man who stood at the helm that day was not the same James Cook who had left 3 years before. His face was thinner, his hair streaked with grey, his eyes distant, calm but unreadable, as if still focused on something far beyond the horizon. He smiled politely at the admirals, bowed to the lords, and accepted the applause of strangers. But his heart was somewhere else, adrift still on the endless sea. For a time, Cook tried to live on land. He stayed with his wife, Elizabeth, and their children in a small, quiet house not far from London. The days were filled with sunlight and conversation, the nights with warmth and rest. But peace, when found, can be a strange thing. After years of endless movement, stillness felt like confinement. The sound of the city, the carts, the bells, the chatter, felt too loud, too close. He missed the rhythm of the waves, the soft breathing of the ocean beneath the stars. Some nights he would wake before dawn, walk out into the garden, and stand there for hours, watching the faint mist drift across the grass, listening to the wind move through the trees. To others, it was just a breeze. To Cook, it sounded like the sea calling him home again. In his journals, now bound and printed for the world, people found maps and measurements, but also poetry. He wrote of waves as living things, of islands as dreams born from the sea, of humanity as one great voyage. He believed that the world was not divided by borders, but connected by water, that the ocean was not a barrier, but a bridge. "The earth," he wrote, "is one body. We sail upon its skin. We breathe its winds and share its tides." It was a thought far ahead of his time, a whisper of unity from an age of conquest. Fame came quietly, and he accepted it the same way. Kings and scholars praised his discoveries. He was invited to dine in great halls, to speak before men who had never smelled salt air. But when they asked him of danger, of storms, of strange peoples and distant lands, he did not tell them tales of fear or triumph. He told them of the stars, of the silence between waves, of the kindness of strangers who shared fruit and laughter on unknown shores. He spoke softly, and those who listened often forgot they were hearing history. It sounded more like prayer. Still, the sea called. It always had. And though his hands were ink-stained and his body tired, his mind was not done exploring. When the Admiralty approached him again, asking him to lead a third voyage, to seek a northern passage, a final mystery, he hesitated only a moment. Elizabeth saw it in his eyes before he spoke. She smiled sadly and said, "You were never meant to stay." Cook nodded. "I belong to the sea," he whispered. And so, once again, he began to prepare. Charts were spread, instruments cleaned, a new crew assembled. He was older now, but his spirit was as steady as ever, a compass drawn always toward the unknown. Before he left, he stood one final time on the cliffs above Whitby, the place where his life had begun. Below him, the sea stretched endless and blue, the same sea that had carried him across the world. The wind brushed through his hair, and he closed his eyes, listening to its voice. It spoke to him as it always had, in whispers of salt and eternity. He thought of the years behind him, the first voyage to Tahiti, the reefs of Australia, the ice of the south, the stars that had guided him. And in that moment he felt no fear of what lay ahead, only peace. He turned from the sea and began walking down the path, his boots crunching softly on the grass. Behind him, the horizon gleamed gold beneath the setting sun, a thin, shining line between earth and heaven. In the year 1776, Captain James Cook set sail once more. It would be his third voyage, and his last. He was older now, his hair touched with grey, his face lined by wind and years, but his eyes still held that steady light, the same calm that had once stared out from Yorkshire fields toward an unseen horizon. He had already mapped the Pacific, crossed the edge of the known world, and returned home a hero. But for Cook, the world's beauty was never something to conquer. It was something to understand. There was one mystery left to chase. The Northwest Passage, a mythical sea route said to cut across the top of the world, linking the great oceans into one. And so, once more, he answered the ocean's call. The ship this time was the HMS Resolution again, refitted, trusted and ready, joined by a second vessel, the Discovery. When they left England, the docks were crowded with onlookers. They cheered and waved, but Cook only nodded quietly, his hand resting on the rail. He knew what the sea demanded: patience, humility, endurance, and he knew what it gave in return: peace, wonder, and the gift of perspective. As the sails filled with wind, the ship slipped down the river and into the open sea, where the horizon waited as always, silent and infinite. Months passed as they crossed the familiar waters of the Atlantic, rounded Cape Horn, and entered once again the vastness of the Pacific. The ocean welcomed him back like an old friend, sometimes fierce, sometimes kind, but always honest. The men worked smoothly, their movements practiced and sure. Cook, though older, moved with the same calm purpose as ever. He spent hours at the helm, his eyes on the horizon, his thoughts somewhere between the waves and the stars. He no longer sought glory, only understanding. In 1778 they reached islands the world had never mapped, green volcanic peaks rising from a silver sea. The air was warm and sweet with flowers. The people who came to greet them smiled openly. Their songs carried over the water like wind. Cook called them the Sandwich Islands, what we now know as Hawaii. To the sailors it was paradise. The beaches golden, the forests rich, the ocean clear as glass. They traded, shared food, and learned words from each other. The islanders welcomed Cook as if he were something more than a man. A spirit, perhaps, who had come from the sea itself. For weeks they stayed there, resting, repairing, and learning the rhythm of the islands. At night, Cook would walk alone along the shore. The moonlight shimmered on the waves. The palms rustled softly behind him. He would stand and watch the horizon, listening to the surf whisper against the sand. It was the same sound he had heard his entire life, from Yorkshire to Tahiti, from ice to fire, the voice of the world calling him home. When the time came to leave, they sailed north, toward the coast of America, to seek the fabled Northwest Passage. They followed the shoreline through fog and rain, past towering cliffs and forests that reached the clouds. The water grew colder again, the sky grey, the wind sharp. They reached Alaska, a land of snow and silence, and tried to push through the icy straits, but the ocean was frozen solid. It was the same lesson the South had taught him years before. The world had no shortcuts. Its mysteries could not be forced. And so he turned back, not defeated, but at peace. The earth, he wrote, is not meant to be conquered, only known. In early 1779, Cook's ships returned to the Hawaiian Islands. The people welcomed them again, drums beating, fires glowing along the beach, canoes gathering in the bay like petals on the tide. The men were weary, their ship weathered, but the warmth of the islands brought comfort. For a time there was peace again, laughter, song, the smell of fruit and sea salt in the air. Cook watched it all quietly, as if memorizing the world one last time. He knew that his life had been long and full, that he had seen more of the earth than any man before him. But even then, he didn't think of himself as a hero. He thought of himself simply as a sailor, a man who had followed the wind and tried to listen. One morning a storm struck suddenly, tearing one of the ship's masts. They were forced to return to shore for repairs. Tensions rose between the sailors and the islanders. Small misunderstandings grew into fear and anger. The peace that had once surrounded them began to fade like light dimming before dusk. On a grey February morning, Cook went ashore to speak with the islanders himself, to calm the waters between them, as he had done so many times before. No one knows exactly how it happened. A spark, a shout, a moment of confusion. But in the struggle that followed, Cook fell. The surf was red for a moment, then white again. The waves closed over him, and the sea, his oldest companion, took him home. News of his death travelled slowly. Months later, when England heard, the world mourned the man who had mapped its edges. But the ocean did not mourn. It kept his memory quietly in the rhythm of waves and the whisper of tides. The islands he had visited still carry his name. The maps he drew still trace the shapes of the world, and the stars he followed still shine above every sea. Some say that when the night is calm and the wind moves just right, you can still hear his voice in the waves, and not words but presence. The steady heart of a sailor who never stopped listening. And so it ends, not with conquest, not with victory, but with peace. Captain James Cook, the boy who dreamed of the horizon, the man who sailed to the ends of the earth, found what he had always sought, not a passage, not a continent, but understanding. The world was not smaller than he imagined. It was infinite. It had no edges, only light. And as the waves rolled endlessly beneath the stars, his story became part of the ocean itself, timeless, calm, and eternal.